Is solitude really freedom, or is it a silent trap? Imagine living year after year, convinced that being alone is the key to focus and success. At first, it feels liberating, like the weight of the world is lifted off your shoulders. You tell yourself that you're free from the chaos of emotional baggage, free from the complexities of human connection. You convince yourself that you're better off without anyone to challenge you. But underneath this convincing story, something quietly begins to unravel. It's subtle, nearly invisible at first, but it's the slow, steady erosion of something fundamental. The hidden cost of emotional isolation. Over time, a man who isolates himself from relationships may not notice it, but he's changing. His thoughts become more narrow, his posture more slumped, and his habits subtly shift. The very core of his identity begins to lose its sharp edges. Without the challenge and mirror of a relationship, especially an intimate one, he begins to stagnate. Relationships are mirrors. They show us parts of ourselves we might otherwise avoid. They shine a light on our inconsistencies, our insecurities, and even our selfishness. And most importantly, they reveal our potential for growth. Is loneliness truly liberating, or does it create a dangerous silence? We all need to grow. Relationships, especially the difficult ones, force us to grow by pushing us to listen, adapt, and confront conflict. These challenges, emotional, intellectual, and even physical, are not just distractions. They are essential for development. They stretch us in ways we couldn't do alone. But what happens when these challenges are absent for too long? When a man spends too much time without the mirror of a relationship, he risks becoming emotionally underdeveloped, even if his career or intellect is flourishing. It's a quiet decline, almost comforting, but in reality, it's a soft decay. What happens to a man when he spends year after year without love, without intimacy, without the raw, refining force of a relationship? At first, it may seem like he's fine. He tells himself he's free, that he's focused, and perhaps even better off alone. But beneath that story, behind the convincing narrative, something crucial is slowly slipping away, quietly, unnoticed. When a man goes extended periods without being in a relationship, he begins to experience a subtle form of psychological stagnation. It doesn't appear as a sudden, visible decline, but rather it creeps into his daily habits, his posture, and his thoughts. His very identity starts to shift in ways he might not immediately recognize. Relationships, especially intimate ones, act as mirrors. They reflect back parts of ourselves that we might prefer to ignore. They shed light on our inconsistencies, our fears, and our selfishness. Most importantly, relationships reveal our potential for growth. Without that mirror, without someone to challenge us or hold up a reflection of ourselves, a man begins to lose the sharp edges of his character. He may appear more comfortable, perhaps even more at peace, but in reality, what's happening is a soft decay. Relationships push us to grow. They force us to adapt, to listen, and to... Is solitude really freedom, or is it a silent trap? Imagine living year after year, convinced that being alone is the key to focus and success. At first, it feels liberating, like the weight of the world is lifted off your shoulders. You tell yourself that you're free from the chaos of emotional baggage, free from the complexities of human connection. You convince yourself that you're better off without anyone to challenge you. But underneath this convincing story, something quietly begins to unravel. It's subtle, nearly invisible at first, but it's a slow, steady erosion of something fundamental. The hidden cost of emotional isolation. Over time, a man who isolates himself from relationships may not notice it, but he's changing. His thoughts become more narrow, his posture more slumped, and his habits subtly shift. The very core of his identity begins to lose its sharp edges. Without the challenge and mirror of a relationship, especially an intimate one, he begins to stagnate. Relationships are mirrors. They show us parts of ourselves we might otherwise avoid. They shine a light on our inconsistencies, our insecurities, and even our selfishness. And most importantly, they reveal our potential for growth. Is loneliness truly liberating, or does it create a dangerous silence? We all need to grow. Relationships, especially the difficult ones, force us to grow by pushing us to listen, adapt, and confront conflict. These challenge emotional, intellectual, and even physical are not just distractions, they are essential for development. They stretch us in ways we couldn't do alone. But what happens when these challenges are absent for too long? When a man spends too much time without the mirror of a relationship, he risks becoming emotionally underdeveloped, even if his career or intellect is flourishing. It's a quiet decline, almost comforting, but in reality, it's a soft decay. What happens to a man when he spends year after year without love, without intimacy, without the raw, refining force of a relationship? At first, it may seem like he's fine. He tells himself he's free, that he's focused, and perhaps even better off alone. But beneath that story, behind the convincing narrative, something crucial is slowly slipping away, quietly, unnoticed. When a man goes extended periods without being in a relationship, he begins to experience a subtle form of psychological stagnation. It doesn't appear as a sudden visible decline, but rather it creeps into his daily habits, his posture, and his thoughts. His very identity starts to shift in ways he might not immediately recognize. Relationships, especially intimate ones, act as mirrors. They reflect back parts of ourselves that we might prefer to ignore. They shed light on our inconsistencies, our fears, and our selfishness. Most importantly, relationships reveal our potential for growth. Without that mirror, without someone to challenge us or hold up a reflection of ourselves, a man begins to lose the sharp edges of his character. He may appear more comfortable, perhaps even more at peace, but in reality, what's happening is a soft decay. Relationships push us to grow. They force us to adapt, to listen, and to... It's not just companionship. It's accountability. It's not just affection, but the transformation that comes from being fully seen by another person. The absence of romantic connection means the absence of someone who truly sees you, not the performance you put on, but your raw, unpolished self. This kind of visibility forces a man to confront himself honestly, to see both his strengths and his vulnerabilities. When that confrontation is absent for too long, blind spots grow, unnoticed and unchallenged. A man might tell himself that he's doing just fine. He eats well. He works out. He's productive. But emotionally and spiritually, he's drifting, floating along without direction. He doesn't see the parts of himself that are weakening because there's no one close enough to notice, to care, or to mirror his growth. Intimacy offers that gaze, the kind of gaze that challenges, anchors, and most importantly, reveals both failure and possibility. Now, this is not to suggest that every man needs to be in a relationship at all times. There are seasons for solitude, times to reflect and grow alone. But when solitude becomes chronic, when it shifts from a period of introspection to avoidance, it quietly erodes the structures of the soul. The longer this condition persists, the harder it becomes to re-enter the relational world. It becomes more difficult to engage without fear, without self-sabotage, and without the need to rebuild the emotional and social muscles that once came naturally. This is the hidden cost of prolonged emotional disconnection, not just loneliness, but a kind of slow psychological sleep. A man spends so much time disconnected from intimacy that his understanding of love and connection becomes more about fantasy than reality. The absence of real emotional engagement creates room for imagination to take root. As time passes, he begins to craft an internal picture of what a relationship should be. Often shaped by memories, idealized media, or fragments of past experiences, this mental construct starts to form a barrier. While comforting at first, it becomes a standard that no real person can meet. It's no longer an image of what's possible, but an unrealistic expectation that no relationship could fulfill. In this state, he may begin to believe that the perfect relationship is just around the corner, waiting for the ideal moment to emerge. He tells himself stories that he's simply waiting for the right person, that no one else is quite right. But does the right moment ever truly come? Or does it simply become another excuse, another reason to remain in the comfort of solitude? Let's now turn our attention to the next chapter in understanding the deeper implications of emotional isolation and the journey toward re-engaging with true intimacy. Building on the idea that our expectations often create barriers to real intimacy, let's now explore how these fantasies can lead to a distorted understanding of relationships. The truth is, a man may convince himself that he's simply being cautious, selective, and protective of his peace. He may believe that he's just being discerning, waiting for the right fit. But in reality, what has happened is that his expectations have inflated over time, growing further from the grounding force of lived experience. The ideal image of a perfect partner has taken root, but it hasn't been tested by the messiness of real life. In real relationships, people disappoint each other, misunderstand each other, and are forced to navigate the complex terrain of emotional needs and conflicting desires. Yet in the realm of imagination, everything is smooth, understanding is instant, affection is effortless, and challenges seem non-existent. The longer a man spends without testing his ideas in the realm of real intimacy, the more he comes to mistake this fantasy for reality. This process of idealization often occurs unconsciously. It doesn't feel like arrogance or perfectionism, it feels like discernment. It's subtle, almost comforting. He might convince himself that he's just being careful, keeping his heart safe, guarding against future pain. But deep beneath that protective shield lies fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of rejection, fear of confronting the parts of himself that only truly surface in the presence of another person. The imagined partner, this idealized vision of someone flawless, becomes a shield. By holding out for perfection, he avoids the vulnerability that comes with opening himself up to someone real, someone imperfect, someone unpredictable. There's a kind of emotional safety in this idealization. When love remains hypothetical, it can't hurt you. It remains under control, like a carefully crafted story that you can edit at will. You decide how she looks, talks, reacts. You control the pace, the depth, and even the emotional landscape of your connection. But this illusion of control comes at a price. You never learn how to compromise, how to create space for another person's differences, or how to navigate the emotional labor that comes with genuine closeness. Real relationships aren't about finding someone who matches your perfect vision. They're about learning how to build something durable with someone whose reality will often challenge your assumptions. Over time, this idealization forms a double bond. On one hand, the man longs for connection. He craves affection, intimacy, and the daily rhythm of shared life. But on the other hand, he's quietly built such a high standard that no potential partner feels like the right fit. He begins to see flaws too quickly, almost instinctively. One comment, one difference in opinion, and he starts to retreat. Not because the person is wrong for him, but because she doesn't align with the perfect image he's been rehearsing in his mind for years. This makes dating feel discouraging. It feels like no one can ever measure up, like every potential partner falls short of a standard that's nearly impossible to reach. But here's the thing, no one can be enough when the criteria are shaped more by fantasy than by grounded human experience. This phenomenon also leads to confusion when a real opportunity for connection finally presents itself. He may sabotage a relationship that could have grown into something beautiful simply because it doesn't feel like the image he's been holding on to. He mistakes the discomfort of growth for incompatibility, expecting harmony without negotiation, romance without awkwardness. The truth is, the discomfort of growth is a necessary part of every meaningful relationship. It's in the struggles, the misalignments, and the moments of vulnerability where the real magic lies. But when idealization takes hold, these necessary challenges are often misinterpreted as signs of failure. As we move forward, let's look deeper into how these self-imposed barriers affect a man's capacity to truly engage with the people around him. Building on the idea of how prolonged solitude distorts expectations and impedes growth, let's now look at how this impacts a man's sense of self and his capacity to truly engage in meaningful relationships. A man may spend so much time holding on to his imagined perfect partner, building fantasies that eventually take on a life of their own. These fantasies become more idealized, more detached from reality. But when reality doesn't measure up to these carefully crafted expectations, he blames the relationship, never realizing that it's his own warped sense of what should be that's the true culprit. The longer this cycle continues, the deeper the fantasy becomes entrenched, and the more difficult it becomes to break free from it. The imagined partner grows more flawless, distant from anything real, and simultaneously the man becomes less prepared for the actual messy challenges of partnership. What once started as a hopeful vision of love turns into a kind of self-imposed prison, keeping him from the very connection he desires. Over time, a man who spends too much time without a relationship begins to feel shifts in his internal structure. It starts subtly, but steadily. Masculine competence, in its truest and most grounded form, isn't simply about physical strength, intellectual ability, or financial success. It is about the capacity to shoulder responsibility, to sacrifice for something greater than oneself, and to lead with integrity through the complexities of human relationships. Intimate relationships, especially those that last long-term, are some of the most potent training grounds for this kind of competence. They push a man to confront not only the world around him, but also the world within him. They demand that he take responsibility not just for his actions, but for their emotional consequences on another person. Without this environment, over time, a man may begin to atrophy not visibly or dramatically, but within the deeper layers of his character. In a relationship, a man is constantly exposed to the reality that his decisions ripple outward. His moods affect someone else. His lack of discipline, his impatience, his temper, even his silence, these things don't just bounce back at him, they land on someone he cares about. This feedback loop generates a sense of accountability that, over time, strengthens him. But when he spends too much time alone, that feedback loop disappears. He becomes his own judge, his own audience, his own mirror. Without the emotional consequences that relationships provide, he starts to lose the sharpness that comes from being watched, needed, and depended upon. He may continue to achieve externally, but internally, the drive to rise above himself weakens, leaving him disconnected from his deeper potential. One of the defining features of masculine energy is the orientation toward order, structure, discipline, and purpose. But purpose, when not tethered to relationship, can become cold, even hollow. A man can build an empire, but if he does it entirely for himself, something vital gets lost. Relationships remind a man of why his strength matters. They give his ambition context. They humanize his discipline. They teach him how to wield power with sensitivity and presence. But when these lessons are absent for too long, he may start confusing success with fulfillment, thinking that outward achievement is enough to sustain him. As we continue to explore this theme, let's delve into how the lack of relational experiences impacts a man's ability to connect with others and develop lasting bonds. Continuing from the idea of how prolonged solitude shapes a man's internal structure, let's now explore how this isolation affects his sense of self, his ability to connect, and his capacity for true leadership. A man may come to confuse dominance with leadership, detachment with strength, and control with love. He may become efficient, but not wise, successful, yet not whole. The erosion of masculine competence in prolonged solitude isn't always immediately noticeable. He might appear well put together, with a routine, a good physique, and a confident demeanor. He manages his finances and speaks with authority. On the surface, he looks like he has it all together. But beneath the surface, there's a depth that only develops through the lived experience of intimacy, through showing up when it's inconvenient, staying when it would be easier to walk away. These qualities aren't something books or podcasts can teach. They come from the daily grind of being in a relationship where theory collapses under the weight of reality. In the absence of this experience, a man may know about love, patience, and humility, but he doesn't know how to live them. The longer he is without that training ground, the weaker those internal muscles grow, like a muscle that hasn't been used in years, becoming stiff and unresponsive. He might start avoiding difficulty instead of confronting it. He may resist responsibility, disguised as the need to protect his freedom. His instinct to step forward when courage is required may diminish simply because no one has demanded it of him in a long time. Slowly, the very concept of sacrifice starts to feel foreign. Putting someone else's needs before his own, once a natural act, may now seem unreasonable, even selfish. What was once an innate impulse to provide, to protect, to grow with someone and for someone begins to shrink into a self-referential loop. Comfort and control take precedence over growth and giving. Masculine competence is not forged in isolation. It is tested, refined, and proven in the presence of another human being, someone who can see you clearly, challenge you, rely on you, and call you out when needed. Without that presence, over time, a man may retain the outward appearance of strength, but the inner core where courage, sacrifice, and service live begins to soften and eventually to fade. The longer a man remains without a relationship, his daily routines, behaviors, and emotional patterns solidify in a way that feels like stability, but is more accurately a form of rigidity. He becomes accustomed to structuring his life entirely around his own needs, preferences, and rhythms. There's no longer a demand to bend, adjust, or compromise. At first, this can feel empowering. No one interrupts his schedule, challenges his choices, or requires emotional availability when he's not in the mood. He has complete control. But as time passes, what once seemed like freedom gradually becomes inflexibility, a prison built by his own design. The ability to adapt, which is central to any relationship, weakens with disuse. When a man lives alone long enough, even small adjustments begin to feel like impositions. He gets used to eating what he wants, sleeping when he wants, and only entertaining the thoughts and opinions he already agrees with. As we move forward, let's delve into how this internal rigidity can further isolate a man from the connections he deeply craves. Continuing from the idea that prolonged isolation leads to rigid self-sufficiency, let's now explore how this internalization can affect a man's ability to engage in healthy, dynamic relationships. In his self-contained world, there's no need to explain himself, no reason to consider another perspective, no call to negotiate shared priorities. While this may seem like comfort, it comes at a significant cost, the cost of relational agility. Relationships require a constant dance of give and take, a softening of the ego, and a willingness to lose an argument for the sake of deeper connection. But without practice, these capacities dull. The man might become so accustomed to his own autonomy that the mere thought of compromise begins to feel like surrender rather than a sign of partnership. His entrenchment in this mindset can manifest in subtle yet deeply consequential ways. He might develop strict habits, routines that are efficient but isolating, leaving little room for spontaneity. Over time, these routines, while bringing a sense of order, may start to distance him from the flexibility needed to adapt to the needs and presence of another person. His world becomes so structured, so predictable, that he finds it increasingly difficult to make space for someone else's presence. He might become hyper-focused on personal goals, hobbies, or rituals, finding himself unwilling or unable to adjust to a partner's desires or plans. Relationships may begin to feel like disruptions rather than enrichments. The unpredictability of another person's emotions, needs, or schedules begins to feel threatening, like an intruder in the carefully ordered life he's built. In this mindset, any potential partner is already at a disadvantage. Instead of meeting them with openness and curiosity, he expects them to fit into a pre-existing mold. Over time, this self-contained lifestyle can create the illusion that the problem lies outside of him. He may start believing that modern dating is flawed, that women are too demanding, or that forming a connection is inherently difficult. But often, what's really happening is that the man has grown so accustomed to living in a self-designed echo chamber that any external input feels jarring. He no longer knows how to share space, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, with another person. He has forgotten the skill of compromise, not because he lacks the capacity, but because he has had no relational reason to use it. And like any skill that goes unused, it begins to atrophy. This kind of relational rigidity is rarely intentional. It builds up quietly, often disguised as efficiency, control, and peace. The man might even pride himself on his discipline and independence, unaware that these very traits, when unchecked, can form walls rather than foundations for a healthy relationship. He might convince himself that he's simply waiting for the right person, someone who won't require him to change too much, but in reality, meaningful relationships always require change. Not in values, but in behavior, in expectations, and in the willingness to merge two lives in a way that creates something neither person could achieve alone. By the time a man enters a relationship after years of solitude, he often struggles with the very things that relationships require: patience, flexibility, and emotional endurance. He may find himself easily irritated, overwhelmed by emotional demands, or resistant to shared decision-making. Not because his partner is difficult, but because he hasn't had to practice these relational skills for so long. Now, let's explore how this inability to adapt can impact a man's emotional growth and his capacity to nurture the relationships he desires. Continuing from the idea that prolonged solitude creates emotional rigidity, let's now explore how this isolation leads to deeper internal struggles and unhealthy patterns. When a man goes without a relationship for too long, the emotional muscles he once used regularly grow stiff from lack of practice. What would have once been minor adjustments now feel like major sacrifices. Small compromises that were easy to make in the past, like sharing space, time, or emotional resources, now seem overwhelming. And unless he becomes aware of this dynamic, he may retreat not into clarity or growth, but into the false comfort of his rigid solitude. The absence of emotional connection for an extended period opens the door to darker internal states. Nihilism, addiction, or subtle self-destructive patterns may begin to form. These don't always present themselves as obvious dysfunction, but rather as quiet, persistent habits that drain his emotional and mental energy. What began as solitude for reflection or healing can slowly morph into emotional withdrawal, where meaning becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. His inner life loses its vibrancy without the grounding forces of love, accountability, and emotional reciprocity. As the isolation deepens, he starts asking questions he might not have had to confront before, questions about the value of his own existence, the purpose behind his efforts, and whether any of it truly matters. In the context of a relationship, even the most mundane routines carry deep meaning. Coming home to someone, cooking a meal together, sharing burdens, these small acts anchor a man's sense of purpose. They remind him that his actions affect others, that his life is part of a larger shared story. But when those connections are missing for too long, the sense of being for something or for someone begins to erode. His work may continue, his hobbies may remain, but a silent drift starts to take hold. His life begins to feel like a closed system, one without external emotional input, and it starts to collapse inward. At first, he may not notice the shift. He might feel free, even liberated for a time, as if the solitude is his own choice, his own peace. But eventually, the silence grows louder. This silence becomes a breeding ground for existential thoughts that have no healthy anchors. Questions like, "What's the point?" or "Does any of this matter?" begin to creep in and grow louder in the absence of relational meaning. Some men respond to these questions with philosophical detachment, trying to rationalize or intellectualize their feelings. Others try to drown out the discomfort altogether, and that's when addiction often enters the picture, though not always in the form of substances. It can be an addiction to distraction hours of mindless scrolling on social media, endless gaming, compulsive consumption of entertainment, pornography, junk food, or even overtraining at the gym. These behaviors, often disguised as routine or discipline, act as methods of numbing the ache of emotional emptiness. They offer a fleeting sense of control or pleasure in an otherwise uncontrollable emotional landscape. This form of escapism is difficult to identify because it blends seamlessly into modern culture. No one questions the man who works long hours, binge watches shows, or disappears into digital worlds. On the surface, he's just living a normal life, like anyone else. But beneath the surface, there's a slow erosion of emotional depth. He stops feeling fully alive. His interactions become shallow, his connections faint. And without awareness, these habits reinforce the very isolation that keeps him from experiencing the depth and fullness of life. As we continue, let's explore how these patterns begin to affect not just his emotional life, but his ability to build and sustain genuine relationships. Building on the idea of emotional isolation, let's now explore how this internal withdrawal can create a self-perpetuating cycle that makes reconnection seem impossible. As the man continues to withdraw emotionally, he stops engaging with the parts of himself that long for intimacy, connection, and vulnerability. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reconnect because he begins to fear what he's lost. The vulnerability required to open up again feels like an insurmountable hurdle. The emotional stamina needed to listen deeply, to truly hear someone else, begins to wane. The courage to let someone see who he has become in the absence of love is something he no longer believes he possesses. Over time, he may begin to experience a kind of emotional deadening. Things that once brought him joy feel muted, distant. Victories, once celebrated with a sense of fulfillment, now feel hollow and insignificant. The beauty that once stirred his soul now passes by unnoticed, like a landscape that no longer captures the imagination. This emotional flattening is a clear sign that meaning is slipping away. For most people, meaning is deeply intertwined with love, service, and the feeling of being truly known. Without those elements, the self becomes isolated, not just physically, but existentially. He begins to feel like a floating entity, untethered from time, responsibility, or community. Yet, from the outside, everything may appear fine. The man may be highly functioning, successful, articulate, capable, but inside, he's living in emotional exile. And exile doesn't always feel like pain. It can feel like numbness, like emptiness, like nothingness. That nothingness is the seed of nihilism, the belief that nothing really matters, that no action carries weight, that existence is just a repetitive cycle without consequence. Once a man begins to drift into that territory, climbing out of it requires more than just logic or productivity. It requires re-entry into a world where connection, risk, and emotional responsibility can restore meaning. It requires engaging in the messy, beautiful chaos of relationship. But when a man spends a long time outside of a romantic relationship, he often begins to craft an identity rooted in avoidance, even if he doesn't consciously realize it. This identity isn't just about being single. It becomes about protecting himself from the vulnerabilities, challenges, and unpredictability that come with emotional closeness. Over time, the avoidance doesn't just shape his choices, shapes who he believes himself to be. At first, this can seem like maturity or self-sufficiency, a sign of strength. He might tell himself that he's simply waiting for the right person or that he's focusing on his goals, but beneath that narrative, something deeper is happening. He starts to build a life where the avoidance of emotional exposure becomes the foundation of his worldview. This identity often begins with subtle shifts. He learns to rationalize disconnection. He begins using language like, relationships are a distraction, or I'm better off alone, not as reflections of truth, but as protective mantras to justify his distance from intimacy. He convinces himself that emotional closeness leads to weakness, that feelings are liabilities, and that needing someone is a form of failure. These beliefs, though they might never be spoken aloud, begin to settle deep into his psyche, guiding his actions and reinforcing the walls he builds. As we explore further, let's take a closer look at how these internal beliefs and barriers affect a man's ability to connect authentically with others. Continuing from the idea of emotional avoidance shaping a man's identity, let's explore how this isolation subtly redefines his perception of relationships and self-worth. Over time, the walls a man builds around himself begin to feel like home. He forgets they were originally built out of fear. This avoidance-based identity doesn't remain internal for long. It spills over and influences every external interaction he has. He starts avoiding situations where emotional vulnerability could arise. He becomes distant in friendships, emotionally unavailable in family dynamics, and quick to exit potential romantic encounters that require him to stretch beyond his comfort zone. Any sign of emotional intensity triggers a retreat, not because he lacks courage, but because he's rehearsed the act of pulling away for so long that it feels like the only safe option. This conditioning is powerful. The more he avoids, the more he forgets how to stay. The more he escapes, the more foreign intimacy begins to feel. He might even start to wear this avoidance as a badge of honor. He identifies with solitude, adopts language and behaviors that reinforce his emotional detachment. Stoicism, independence, or high standards become shields, not just from others, but from his own unmet emotional needs. In this place, it becomes increasingly difficult to recognize longing when it arises. When the hunger for connection surfaces, he mistakes it for weakness. When the opportunity for love presents itself, he questions its authenticity or his own readiness. Over time, he has trained himself not to want what he needs the most. This avoidance becomes so embedded that it alters his perception of himself. He no longer sees himself as someone who could thrive in a relationship. He believes he's not the relationship type, that he's too complicated, or that he's simply better off on his own. These narratives provide a sense of safety, but they're built on unresolved wounds. At their core, they're not truths about his nature. They are defense mechanisms against past pain, rejection, disappointment, or failure that have gone unprocessed. The longer this identity remains unchallenged, the more alien love begins to feel. He loses the emotional muscle memory required to let someone in. What's especially difficult about this shift is that it doesn't always feel like suffering. It can feel like control, like peace, but it's a peace born from disengagement, not fulfillment. The man doesn't feel the sharpness of heartbreak because he's kept love at arm's length for so long. But in doing so, he also cuts himself off from joy, intimacy, and the deep transformation that only comes from allowing someone else into the most guarded parts of him. His identity becomes one of the lone wolf, the outsider, the emotionally untouchable. And over time, that identity can feel permanent, as though it's an inherent part of who he is. But at its root, this identity was only ever a response to fear. The longer a man has been without a relationship, the more he risks losing access to the parts of himself that are activated only in intimacy. His adaptability, his emotional courage, his capacity to love and be loved in return. Isolation doesn't just preserve his peace, it quietly reshapes his expectations, erodes his relational competence, and builds a worldview rooted in control rather than connection. He may become efficient, successful, even outwardly content. But beneath the surface, something vital is starving the part of him that is meant to serve, to grow alongside another, to be refined through responsibility, discomfort, and devotion. He begins to mistake fantasy for reality, solitude for strength, and detachment for wisdom. But without the relational mirror of love, he cannot see his blind spots. You cannot grow beyond the limits of self-reflection. Eventually, the cost of emotional safety becomes existential loneliness. The man who waits too long may find that when love finally comes, he no longer knows how to receive it. Not because he is incapable, but because he has trained himself over years to live without. As we delve deeper, let's look at the consequences of this emotional withdrawal on his relationships and what happens when he finally confronts the need for change. So, through this journey of exploring the deep impacts of solitude and emotional avoidance, we've seen that while independence may offer a sense of safety, it also causes us to miss out on the true strength found in love and connection. When we build walls to protect ourselves, we unknowingly block access to the most precious things in life: love, sharing, and growth. So, are you ready to break down those walls and embrace new opportunities for connection? Are you willing to face the pain to find true joy in relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future videos. If you found this video helpful, please share it with your friends and leave a like to let us know you want more meaningful content like this. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell to get the latest updates from the channel. Let's push past our limits and build genuine connections in life. See you in the next video, where we'll continue to explore and share even more meaningful topics.